What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy sits down for what should be a routine morning interview, only to discover the host has a completely different agenda? Well, you're about to find out. And trust me, this is one morning television moment that nobody saw coming. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story is absolutely wild from start to finish. It was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance. Clint Eastwood, the man who defined cool in Hollywood for over 6 decades, had agreed to appear on Good Morning America to discuss his latest film project. At 94, Eastwood still commanded respect in the industry, and his presence on any talk show was considered a major booking. The network executives were thrilled to have secured the interview, knowing that Eastwood rarely did television appearances anymore. George Stephanopoulos had been briefed on the talking points. The conversation was meant to focus on Eastwood's new movie, his reflections on his career, and perhaps some light discussion about his directing process. Standard fare for a morning show interview. The producers had even prepared a montage of clips from Eastwood's most famous films to play during the segment. But from the moment Eastwood walked onto the set, something felt different. The legendary actor moved with his characteristic slow, deliberate pace, his steely blue eyes taking in everything around him. He settled into the guest chair across from Stephanopoulos, adjusting his jacket with the same methodical precision he brought to everything he did. "Good morning, Clint." Stephanopoulos began with his practiced television smile. "Thanks for joining us today." "Morning," Eastwood replied in his familiar growly voice, his expression neutral but alert. The first few minutes proceeded normally enough. Stephanopoulos asked about the new film, and Eastwood provided his typical, measured responses. He spoke about the project with genuine enthusiasm, describing the story and the talented cast he had worked with. His answers were thoughtful and engaging, exactly what the morning show audience expected from the Hollywood icon. But then, Stephanopoulos began to steer the conversation in a different direction. "Clint, you've been in this business for a very long time," Stephanopoulos said, his tone shifting slightly. "You've seen Hollywood change dramatically over the decades. Some would say that the industry has become more socially conscious, more aware of representation and diversity. How do you feel about those changes?" Eastwood's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the question he had been expecting, and it certainly wasn't part of the agreed-upon topics for discussion. "Well," George Eastwood said slowly, "I think good stories are good stories regardless of who tells them or who stars in them. I've always believed in hiring the best person for the job, but surely you recognized that the industry needed to change." Stephanopoulos pressed on that there were systemic issues that required addressing. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop a few degrees. Eastwood's jaw tightened slightly, a sign that anyone who knew him would recognize as a warning. "I think," Eastwood said, his voice taking on that familiar edge that had made him famous in westerns, "that good filmmaking has always been about telling honest stories with authentic characters. Politics and agendas tend to get in the way of that." Stephanopoulos leaned forward, sensing an opportunity. "But isn't it political to ignore these issues, to pretend that representation doesn't matter?" "I'm not pretending anything," Eastwood replied, his voice remaining calm, but with an underlying steel. "I'm saying that when you start making movies to check boxes instead of telling stories, you end up with propaganda, not entertainment." The studio audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This was clearly not the lighthearted morning television they had come to see. The camera operators exchanged glances, unsure whether to keep rolling or cut to commercial. "That's an interesting perspective," Stephanopoulos said, though his tone suggested he found it anything but interesting. "Some might say that's the privilege of someone who's never had to worry about representation." Eastwood's eyes flashed. "Privilege, son. I grew up during the Depression. I dug swimming pools and worked in a steel mill before I ever set foot on a movie set. I earned everything I got through hard work, not through anyone's idea of what I deserved because of who I was. But you have to admit that the industry was different then," Stephanopoulos continued, seemingly oblivious to the warning signs. "Opportunities weren't equally available to everyone. The industry was tough on everyone," Eastwood shot back. "I spent years getting rejected, playing bit parts, working for practically nothing. Nobody handed me anything because I was white or male or anything else. I succeeded because I kept working when other people gave up." The tension in the studio was palpable. Now, the producers in the control room were frantically trying to decide whether to intervene or let the confrontation play out. This was either going to be a disaster or the most talked about morning show segment in years. "I think you're missing the point," Stephanopoulos said, his professional composure beginning to slip. "The system itself was biased." "The system was tough," Eastwood corrected. "There's a difference between something being difficult and something being unfair. Life isn't supposed to be easy. Movies aren't supposed to be therapy sessions where everyone gets a participation trophy." Steph's face was beginning to flush. "So, you don't think there were barriers that prevented talented people from getting opportunities?" "I think there are always barriers," Eastwood replied evenly. "The question is whether you spend your time complaining about them or finding ways to overcome them." The interview was rapidly spiraling away from anything resembling morning television pleasantries. What had started as a promotional appearance was turning into something much more intense and personal. Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. If anything, Eastwood's measured responses seemed to embolden the host, as if he sensed weakness in the legendary actor's refusal to engage with his loaded questions. But Clint, surely you can acknowledge that your generation of filmmakers had advantages that others didn't. Stephanopoulos pressed, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone. The old boy network, the exclusionary practices. Eastwood's expression hardened. My generation, you mean the generation that fought in World War II? The generation that built this country into what it became? That generation. That, end quote. I mean, the generation that controlled Hollywood for decades while keeping others out. Stephanopoulos shot back, abandoning any pretense of journalistic neutrality. The studio fell completely silent. Even the crew members stopped what they were doing to watch this unprecedented confrontation unfold. Eastwood slowly leaned back in his chair, studying Stephanopoulos with the same intensity he had once brought to staring down outlaws and spaghetti westerns. George Eastwood said, his voice dangerously quiet. I think you've got me confused with someone else. I've never kept anyone out of anything. I've hired actors and crew members based on one thing, their ability to do the job, period. That's easy to say now, Stephanopoulos replied, his confidence growing. But the record speaks for itself. How many of your films featured diverse casts? How many women directors did you champion? Eastwood's hands gripped the arms of his chair. The record. Let me tell you about the record, son. I made movies about subjects that mattered. I told stories about real people facing real challenges. I didn't make casting decisions based on some checklist dreamed up by people who never spent a day on a movie set. So, you admit that diversity wasn't a priority for you, Stephanopoulos said as if he had just scored a major point. I admit that good storytelling was my priority, Eastwood replied, his voice rising slightly for the first time. Always has been, always will be. You want to know about diversity? I made movies about soldiers, cops, cowboys, boxers, ordinary people trying to make their way in the world. I showed America to itself, warts and all, but you showed it from a very specific perspective, Stephanopoulos countered. The perspective of white male conservative America. That did it. Eastwood's famous composure finally cracked. Conservative America, he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his legendary intensity. You think Unforgiven was conservative. You think $1 Million Baby was some right-wing fantasy. You obviously haven't been paying attention to the movies I've been making. Those are exceptions, Stephanopoulos dismissed. Your overall body of work promotes a very specific worldview. My worldview? Eastwood leaned forward, his eyes blazing. My worldview is that people should take responsibility for their actions, work hard for what they want, and treat others with respect. If that's controversial to you, then maybe you're the one with the problem. The producers in the control room were in full panic mode now. This was supposed to be a feel-good segment about a Hollywood legend, not a political interrogation, but Stephanopoulos seemed determined to push forward. But don't you think your films perpetuate certain stereotypes about masculinity, about violence as a solution to problems? The host continued relentlessly. Eastwood stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor. The sound echoed through the silent set like a gunshot. Stereotypes, he said, towering over the seated host. You want to talk about stereotypes? How about the stereotype that everyone who doesn't agree with your political views is automatically a racist or a sexist or whatever other label you want to slap on them? Stephanopoulos looked momentarily stunned by Eastwood's physical presence, but he pressed on. I'm just asking legitimate questions about your work and its impact. No, you're not, Eastwood said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his decades in Hollywood. You're trying to ambush me on live television because you think it'll make good television. You invited me here under false pretenses to talk about my new movie, and instead, you're trying to prosecute me for the crime of making movies that people actually want to see. I think you're being overly sensitive, Stephanopoulos said, trying to regain control of the situation. Sensitive. Eastwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. George, I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I've been criticized by professionals, by experts, by people who actually understand what it takes to make a movie. But I've never had someone sit across from me and accuse me of being a bad person. Because my movies don't match their political agenda. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat. That's not what I'm doing. That's exactly what you're doing, Eastwood replied. And you're doing it badly. You want to have a political discussion? Fine, but don't hide behind journalism and pretend this is about my career. You've got an axe to grind, and you thought you could use me to sharpen it. Stephanopoulos' face was now noticeably red. I'm trying to have a thoughtful conversation about important issues. No, you're trying to create a moment, Eastwood said, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. You're trying to get me to say something that you can clip and use to support whatever narrative you're pushing this week. But I'm not playing that game. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Studio audience members were looking around nervously, unsure whether they should be witnessing this confrontation. The camera operators continued filming, though several had their hands hovering over their equipment, ready to cut at any moment. "I think you're misunderstanding my intentions," Stephanopoulos said weakly. "Your intentions are crystal clear," Eastwood replied. "You booked me for this show, hoping to make me the villain in your little morality play. Well, congratulations, George, you got your confrontation. I hope it was worth it." Stephanopoulos was clearly rattled, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. If anything, Eastwood's direct challenge seemed to ignite something defensive and ugly in the host. "You know what, Clint?" Stephanopoulos said, his professional mask finally slipping completely. "Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being questioned about your legacy. Maybe you're not used to someone actually challenging your outdated views." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in the street of an old western town. Eastwood stared at the host for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Outdated views," he repeated slowly. "Son, let me tell you something about outdated views. I believe in treating people with dignity regardless of who they are. I believe in earning respect through your actions, not demanding it because of your identity. I believe in telling stories that matter to real people living real lives. If those are outdated views, then I'm proud to be outdated. But you have to admit that the world has moved beyond the simplistic morality of your films." Stephanopoulos continued, apparently unable to recognize how badly he was misreading the situation. "Today's audiences want more complexity, more nuance. Two. Eastwood's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Complexity. You want to lecture me about complexity? I made a movie about a racist old man who learns to see past his prejudices. I made a movie about a female boxer fighting against a world that didn't believe in her. I made movies about the cost of violence, the burden of leadership, the price of redemption. But apparently none of that matters to you because I didn't check the right political boxes. Those themes were always secondary to the main narrative," Stephanopoulos insisted. "Your films primarily celebrate a certain type of masculine heroism that many people find problematic today." "Problematic?" Eastwood repeated, shaking his head. "There's that word again. Everything's problematic to you people, isn't it? Standing up for what's right is problematic. Taking responsibility for your actions is problematic. Protecting the people you care about is problematic." The studio was now completely silent, except for the hum of the cameras and lights. Even the producers had stopped trying to intervene, perhaps realizing that this confrontation had taken on a life of its own. "I'm not saying those things are inherently wrong," Stephanopoulos said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm saying that your films present them in a way that excludes other perspectives. Other voices. Eastwood's voice rose again. "George, I've been making movies for over 50 years. I've worked with actors from every background imaginable. I've told stories about every kind of person you can think of. But apparently that doesn't count because I didn't make enough speeches about it or pat myself on the back for my enlightened casting choices. But surely you can see how your influence shaped Hollywood in ways that weren't always positive." The host pressed on relentlessly. That was the final straw. Eastwood's composure, legendary for its unshakable.com, finally shattered completely. "My influence," he roared, his voice echoing through the studio with startling power. "You want to know about my influence? I helped create an entire genre of filmmaking. I showed that movies could be both popular and meaningful. I proved that audiences were hungry for stories about real human beings facing real moral choices. And yes, I made money doing it because that's how the movie business works." Stephanopoulos tried to interrupt, but Eastwood was just getting started. "But more than that," he continued, his voice carrying the full weight of his anger and frustration. "I employed thousands of people over the decades. Actors, writers, directors, crew members, craftsmen, artists. I gave opportunities to people who deserve them based on their talent and their dedication. I created jobs. I created careers. I created an entire body of work that people still watch and appreciate decades later. I understand that," Stephanopoulos said weakly. "But no, you don't understand." Eastwood cut him off. "You don't understand anything about what it takes to make a movie, what it costs, what's at stake every single time you roll the cameras. You sit behind a desk and pontificate about representation and diversity and social justice, but you've never put your own money on the line to tell a story. You've never had to convince investors to take a chance on your vision. You've never had to look a crew member in the eye and tell them that the movie's been canceled and they're out of work." The host was visibly squirming now, but his arrogance wouldn't let him concede the point. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that kept Hollywood from progressing," he said desperately. "This focus on profit over principles." Eastwood stared at him in disbelief. "Profit over principles. George, without profit, there are no movies. Without commercial success, there are no jobs, no stories, no anything. You can have all the principles in the world, but if nobody wants to watch what you're making, you're not changing anything. You're just talking to yourself. But surely art should be about more than just commercial appeal, Stephanopoulos argued. Art, Eastwood's voice was now dripping with contempt. You want to lecture me about art? I've been making art for longer than you've been breathing. Real art, art that speaks to people, art that matters. Not the kind of pretentious self-congratulatory garbage that wins awards but puts audiences to sleep. The confrontation had now reached a fever pitch. Eastwood was standing over Stephanopoulos, his legendary presence filling the entire studio. The host looked small and petty by comparison, his carefully constructed media persona crumbling under the weight of the actor's righteous anger. Look, Stephanopoulos said, trying one last desperate attempt to regain control. I think we're getting off track here. All I'm trying to do is have an honest conversation about your career and its impact on popular culture. Honest, Eastwood laughed harshly. There's nothing honest about this ambush. You brought me here under false pretenses, to try to score political points, and when I wouldn't play along, you decided to attack me personally. That's not journalism. George Pet's activism masquerading as journalism. I resent that characterization, Stephanopoulos said, his voice rising defensively. Resent it all you want, Eastwood replied. It's the truth. You've already made up your mind about me and everything I represent. This whole interview was just an attempt to get me to confirm your preconceived notions. The studio was electric with tension. Everyone present could sense that this confrontation was about to reach its climax. I think you're being unfair, said, but his voice lacked conviction. Eastwood looked down at him with something approaching pity. Unfair? You know what's unfair, George. What's unfair is inviting someone onto your show to promote their work and then spending the entire time trying to tear down their life's accomplishments. What's unfair is using your platform to push a political agenda instead of doing your job. As a journalist, he paused, his steely gaze never leaving Stephanopoulos' face. But you know what? I'm done with this charade. I came here to talk about movies, about storytelling, about the craft that I love. Instead, I got ambushed by someone who thinks he knows better than 50 years of experience in this business. Eastwood reached down and began unhooking his microphone with deliberate, practiced movements. Wait, Stephanopoulos said, suddenly realizing that his big moment was slipping away from him. We're not finished here. Eastwood looked up from the microphone, his expression cold and final. Oh, we're finished. All right, I don't have to sit here and listen to you disrespect me, my work, or the people I've worked with over the years. I've made my last movie, George, but I haven't forgotten how to walk off a set when someone's wasting my time. You can't just leave, Stephanopoulos protested. This is live television. Watch me, Eastwood replied, dropping the microphone onto his chair where it landed with a sharp thud that echoed through the stunned studio. He turned to face the cameras directly, his legendary presence commanding every eye in the room. Folks, he said, addressing the audience at home with the same gravitas he had brought to countless movie roles. I apologize that you had to witness this. I came here to talk about making movies, about telling stories that matter. Instead, I got lectured by someone who apparently thinks that decades of hard work and success count for nothing if you don't subscribe to the right political beliefs. Stephanopoulos tried to interject, but Eastwood silenced him with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. I've spent my entire career trying to entertain people, to tell stories that resonate with audiences, to create something lasting and meaningful. If that's not good enough for some people, well, that's their problem, not mine. With that, the 94-year-old legend turned and walked off the set with the same measured, dignified pace he had maintained throughout his legendary career. The studio remained in stunned silence as his footsteps echoed through the space, growing fainter until they disappeared completely. Stephanopoulos sat alone at the interview desk, his face flushed and his composure completely shattered. He looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would tell him what to do next. But the crew members and producers were all staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to disappointment. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the host's humiliation as he struggled to find words that would somehow salvage the situation. But there were no words that could undo what had just happened. In trying to diminish a Hollywood legend, George Stephanopoulos had only succeeded in diminishing himself. The greatest showdown in morning television history was over, and there was no question about who had emerged victorious. So, what do you think about Clint Eastwood's legendary exit from that disastrous Good Morning America interview? Did George Stephanopoulos get what he deserved for trying to ambush the Hollywood icon? Let me know in the comments below.